Welcome to the Iran 1400 Project podcast, where we explore the past, present, and possible futures of Iran through informed dialogue, independent thought, and diverse voices. From historical insight to emerging narratives, we connect ideas to action in the pursuit of a more just, inclusive, and forward-looking society. Join us as we rethink Iran's trajectory, one conversation at a time.
Okay, let's dive in. We're talking about a word that carries incredible weight, a rallying cry that's echoed through a century of Iranian history, and one you've definitely heard recently, especially in the news: Azadi. Freedom.
It's such a powerful concept, isn't it? More than just, a simple translation of freedom. It's a word that seems to hold the accumulated hopes and frustrations and struggles of generations.
Absolutely. And that's what we're exploring today. We're doing a deep dive into Azadi in Iran, specifically looking at how its meaning hasn't stayed still, but has transformed pretty dramatically over the past 100 years or so.
Yeah, and this is all based on the material you shared with us, particularly focusing on this great article by Vafal Mostaqim.
Our goal is to really unpack this evolution, to help you see the different layers, the historical context, and the intellectual currents that have shaped what freedom means.
And perhaps what it could mean looking forward, yeah.
Think of this as your shortcut to really getting a handle on this absolutely vital and, complex idea. As the article points out, Azadi isn't like a fixed dictionary definition.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's been constantly defined, sometimes narrowed, sometimes expanded by political systems, ideologies, intellectual movements.
It's where public frustration meets civic longing. That's a great phrase from the piece.
It really is.
Yeah.
And what's truly fascinating is how the very question of what freedom means in Iran today is that the freedom to vote, to dress as you choose, to speak your mind, to believe, to simply belong.
Yeah.
That question has received such radically different answers depending on the era. So let's trace that journey.
Okay, let's start by grounding ourselves in the history, because the article does such a good job laying out this timeline. How did the meaning of Azadi first really formalize in the modern era?
Well, the story the article tells really kicks off between 1906 and 1953. This is the period of the Constitutional Revolution and its aftermath. And here, Azadi was very much about limiting the absolute power of the monarchy. That was the core idea.
So it was about establishing a new political order, fundamentally.
Exactly. It meant creating a law-based system,
Right.
Establishing institutions like a national assembly, trying to get an independent judiciary, advocating for a free press.
Right, the building blocks.
Yeah, shifting from rule by decree to rule by law. That was the goal.
And were people thinking about what individual freedom meant within this new system? Or was it purely structural?
Oh, definitely thinking about it. The article highlights thinkers like Mirza Malcolm Khan, who was really pushing for modern legal frameworks and individual rights.
Okay.
And someone like Ahmad Khosravi, who was debating what it meant to be a modern independent nation. They were sort of grappling with how individual liberty fit into this bigger project of building a modern Iranian identity.
Okay, so curbing the monarchy, establishing a constitutional state that was phase one, roughly. What happened after the 1953 coup? Because the focus seems to shift quite dramatically then.
It really does. A major turning point. From 1953 to 1979, in that post-coup era, Azadi increasingly became defined by the struggle against foreign influence.
Okay.
It transformed into a concept centered on national sovereignty and resisting external domination, particularly, Western power.
And figures emerged who really embodied that struggle, right?
Precisely. Mohammad Mossadegh, even after he was overthrown, he remained this powerful symbol of that democratic nationalist aspiration that had been cut short.
Right.
And then you saw revolutionary thinkers like Ali Shariati and Jalal Ali Ahmad become really prominent.
And their take was different.
Yeah, they weren't just talking about political freedom in the, let's say, Western sense. They framed Azadi as resistance to Western cultural and political penetration, seeing freedom as a kind of intellectual and spiritual liberation from these external forces.
Wow. That's a huge shift, yeah. From constitutional law to anti-imperial resistance. And then comes the Islamic Revolution in 1979. How was Azadi redefined during that period, say from 1979 up to maybe 1997?
Well, this marked another radical transformation. The new ruling elite They reinterpreted freedom entirely through an Islamic framework.
Okay.
Under the doctrine of Velayat Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist Azadi became conditional, fundamentally conditional.
Meaning
Meaning it was only permissible, only seen as real freedom, if it stayed strictly within the boundaries of divine law, as interpreted by the ruling clergy, of course.
So freedom wasn't an inherent right anymore, but something granted and limited by religious authority.
That's essentially it, yeah. And dissent wasn't just seen as, political opposition. It was often framed as deviation from religious orthodoxy, almost like a spiritual failing, you could say. Personal freedoms were heavily subordinated to achieving this idea of ideological and religious purity for the whole society.
That sounds like a period of pretty significant restriction. Did that understanding of Azadi start to shift again?
Yes, definitely. The reform era, let's say roughly from 1997 to 2022, it opened up space for reevaluation. Now, the fundamental structure of the system remained, but Azadi started to be discussed and demanded in broader terms again. It expanded to include things like cultural expression, the rise of digital speech, big debates around women's rights, and pushes for political reform.
Even with those structural limits still very much in place.
Exactly. The limits were still there, absolutely. But there was more room to push against them and redefine what freedom meant in practice on the ground.
And we saw key movements during this time explicitly broaden the definition even further, didn't we?
He did. Very important movement.
Like the Green Movement?
The Green Movement in 2009 was critical, yeah. Pushing for greater political freedoms, a voice for citizens. And then, of course, the women's protests of 2022 brought this incredibly powerful new dimension, demanding bodily autonomy, gender equity, freedom from coercion. They explicitly linked Azadi to fundamental personal dignity and control over one's own life, a very personal yet deeply political framing.
And how about the period since those 2022 uprisings? The article suggests another evolution might be underway.
Yes, it seems so. The most recent uprisings, the article argues, signal a significant shift toward understanding Azadi as civic dignity.
Civic dignity, what does that entail?
It's about the fundamental right to be seen, to be heard, to live without constant fear, and crucially, to participate meaningfully in shaping the society you actually live in.
So moving beyond just political rights or personal rights to something more foundational about citizenship itself.
Precisely. And the article connects this latest phase to broader global trends. We're seeing things like ethical resistance, the power of civic solidarity, and the effectiveness of nonviolent civil power in challenging authoritarian systems.
Wow, tracing that journey is incredible. From curbing a monarchy to national resistance, then religious conformity, expanding to personal rights, and now centering on civic dignity. What does seeing Azadi through this historical lens tell us overall?
Well, it just shows us how incredibly dynamic and contested the concept is, right? And it's not some fixed ideal just waiting there to be achieved. It's constantly being reinterpreted, redefined by the context, by power struggles, and critically, by the demands and aspirations of the people themselves. Understanding this history is just essential, I think, for grasping the depth and the weight of the word Azadi today.
It really puts the contemporary calls for Azadi in a much richer, much deeper context. Now, moving beyond just the timeline, the article also looks at Azadi through different lenses, philosophical, legal, cultural, and so on. Each one seems to add another layer to its complexity.
Absolutely. It's not just one thing. Let's look at the philosophical lens first. The sources go way back here, pointing to early ideas, perhaps in Zoroaster's teachings, found in the Gathas, these ancient hymns.
Really? How so?
Well, Shervin Vakili interprets these as hinting at a kind of ethical free will, the idea of freedom not just from external constraint, but freedom towards something positive, towards truth, righteousness, moral choice.
So freedom has an ethical dimension baked in from very early on.
That perspective is certainly present in the tradition, yeah. And in a more modern philosophical view, the article mentions Vusaganijad, who emphasizes that individual moral agency, the capacity to make reasoned ethical choices, is absolutely necessary for freedom to be meaningful at all. It can't just be license.
Interesting. Then there's the legal lens, which the article highlights as a source of, significant tension.
Oh, huge tension. This is a key point. Iran's constitutions, both the original 1906 one and the current 1979 one, on paper, They claim to protect fundamental freedoms, belief, expression, assembly. They write down certain rights.
But the reality on the ground is often very different.
Drastically different, often. The sources point out how parallel legal structures, things like really restrictive press laws, the mandatory hijab rules, the existence and function of revolutionary courts consistently limit or even outright negate those constitutional rights.
So the judiciary doesn't always uphold those freedoms?
Often, it seems to serve political ends, rather than uphold legal principles or protect citizens' freedoms. The contrast between the rights written down and the actual lived experience of Iranians is a central tension the article explores. It's stark.
It sounds like the law provides a kind of framework, but not necessarily a guarantee of freedom in practice. What about the cultural and literary lens? How does Azadi show up there?
Well, Persian literature, poetry, art, they've historically carried a heavy burden, you could say. They often become the space for expressing feelings and ideas that might be forbidden or dangerous in the political or legal spheres.
So freedom finds another kind of expression there.
Exactly. It's a crucial outlet. Think of figures like the poet Farrokh Farrokhzad, whose work explored personal and social freedoms, especially from a woman's perspective, in really groundbreaking ways.
Right.
Or the writer Sadegh Hedayat, known for his kind of existential themes, which you can easily read as grappling with the profound lack of freedom and agency in the world.
And this continues today.
Oh, yeah. Modern protest murals, underground films, independent music, they all continue this tradition. They explore Azadi less as a formal political right and more as an inner necessity, an act of imagination sometimes or defiance that exists perhaps beyond the immediate reach of laws or political systems.
Culture providing a different kind of space for freedom. Interesting. The article also brings in a historical structural lens, using Abbas Amanat's work on Iran's deep-seated dualities. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yes, this looks at how freedom, or the lack of it, is shaped by these core ongoing tensions within Iranian society itself, these deep structures.
Like what?
Like the duality of din and dolet, religion and state. The post-1979 system fundamentally linked religious conformity to governance, which naturally made freedom conditional on spiritual alignment.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or bum and bar center and periphery, where centralized power, often based in Tehran, frequently marginalizes and excludes regions from meaningful civic life or access to resources, and Iran and Ain Iran, the self and the other. This constant negotiation of national identity in relation to external forces, which we saw in the anti-imperial phase.
And how do these dualities impact Azadi?
They create these built-in fault lines, inherent fragility. They help explain why freedom is often experienced so unevenly across society and why attempts to define or achieve it are constantly battling these entrenched structural tensions. It's not just about ideology, it's about these deep historical patterns.
There's another unique perspective highlighted, the ethical spiritual lens, particularly drawing on Baha'i thought. Now, this tradition is often outside the mainstream discourse in Iran, but the article suggests it offers a valuable view.
Yeah, it does, and it's interesting it's included. While often marginalized or persecuted in Iran, the Baha'i faith, which originated there in the 19th century, put forward ideas very early on that really resonate with modern understandings of freedom.
Such as?
Well, Abdul-Baha, a central figure in the faith, was talking about freedom of conscience, gender equality, the unity of humanity, long before these were widely accepted concepts globally.
And how does this relate specifically to Azadi?
The article frames Abdul-Baha's vision not as advocating for just personal license, doing whatever you want,
right,
but for moral responsibility.
Yeah.
It's a perspective that sees freedom as the capacity for ethical agency, the ability and the responsibility to act justly, to serve others, to uphold universal human values. It's an interesting take that tries to potentially bridge traditional spirituality with transformative social ideals.
A different emphasis. And finally, let's look at the civic lens, which the article brings forward through Aram Hessami's work, 2-3 words. This seems to offer a distinct path forward, maybe.
This perspective is really important, I think, for understanding current discussions. It grounds freedom not just in defiance against oppression, although that's part of it, but fundamentally in civic responsibility. Hessami's view, as presented, is that Azadi isn't just liberation from something. It's actually a call to participate actively in the ongoing work of building a just and flourishing society.
So it's not just about being free, but what you do with that freedom, the application of it.
Exactly. Freedom is seen as most meaningful when it's exercised for the collective well-being. It's a move beyond just expressing grievance, which is necessary, towards actively contributing, cooperating, and engaging in ethical reasoning within the public sphere.
That sounds like it requires a different set of skills or habits, not just rights.
It absolutely does. This model stands in contrast to both authoritarianism, which obviously denies agency, and maybe simple populism, which can sometimes be purely reactive or based on grievance alone.
Okay.
It requires developing habits of dialogue, listening, self-restraint, compromise, and importantly, imagination, the capacity to imagine and then actually build better institutions together. In this view, Azadi becomes an active practice of democratic renewal, not just a static right you possess.
That's a powerful idea, Azadi, as a practice, a responsibility. So given all these historical shifts and these different ways of seeing the word, the article suggests Azadi is maybe at risk of being weakened or hollowed out by overuse or even co-opted politically. How can its meaning truly be reclaimed and made meaningful again?
Well, the key, as the sources seem to imply, is to ground it back firmly in lived experience and ethical aspiration. It needs to feel tangible, connected to people's actual lives and their deepest hopes for the kind of society they want to live in.
Okay. And what are the core elements of that reclamation? What would that look like?
I think it means upholding the fundamental right to dissent without fear. That's basic. It means empowering citizens with the ability to truly participate in public life, not just voting, but having their voices heard and actually influencing decisions.
Right.
And crucially, it means fostering the collective responsibility to build inclusive institutions that serve everyone, regardless of their background, their beliefs, their ethnicity, whatever.
And the article makes a strong point, doesn't it? That reclaiming Azadi doesn't mean Iranians have to just adopt some external model wholesale.
Exactly. It's definitely not presented as a choice between, say, some idealized Western liberalism on one hand and the current ideological authoritarianism on the other. The argument is more that Iranians can and should draw on their own deep philosophical, literary, civic, and ethical traditions, the very things we've been discussing, to define freedom on their own terms, in a way that is authentic and relevant to their specific society and history.
So to kind of recap our journey here, we've seen Azadi evolve across a whole century, starting as a call for constitutional limits on power, becoming a force of anti-imperial resistance, then being redefined as a conditional religious duty,
later expanding to encompass broader rights and identity questions, and most recently, perhaps crystallizing around this concept of civic dignity and ethical agency. It's been quite a ride.
Yeah. And we've explored how this incredibly complex word can be viewed through all these different lenses: the tension in legal frameworks, the expressive power of culture and art, the weight of those deep historical dualities,
the ethical dimensions, both ancient and modern, and this emerging emphasis on the responsibility inherent in civic duty.
It's clear that Azadi is just layered with history and meaning. As the sources we looked at today really highlight, it remains both a powerful memory and a persistent, driving hope in Iran. Its specific meanings have shifted, they've been fought over, but its fundamental power as a concept, as a cry, endures.
And perhaps by reimagining freedom, not just as a fixed destination, or a simple right to be left alone, but as this evolving, active civic practice that's rooted in ethics, in dignity, and ongoing dialogue. What possibilities does that open up?
That's a really interesting question. And it's one that extends far beyond Iran, doesn't it? It makes us think about what freedom really means and how it's practiced or could be practiced anywhere in the world. That's a conversation that certainly continues well beyond the sources we've explored today.
Thank you for listening to the Iran 1400 Project podcast. The Iran 1400 Project invites scholars, experts, and intellectuals to share their assessment of the evolution of institutions and ideas during the past 100 years to inspire a vision of Iran in the 1400s. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. For more content and upcoming events, visit Iran1400.org. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful.